So let's talk about an absolutely enormous Space Marine plastic siege tank, perhaps shortly to be rumbling to a battlefield near you. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about Games Workshop's latest 40k tank reveal, and going over the new model for the Typhon heavy siege tank, plus the 40k rules for it as well. This thing basically takes the idea of a Vindicator siege tank, but mounts an even bigger gun on an improved Land Raider Spartan style chassis, and is deployed to breach the enemy lines asunder and bust their bunkers and armoured vehicles. So the Typhon tank is another Forge World kit that's remade in plastic. This one's been around for really quite a long time, and Games Workshop do seem to be going pretty heavily on phasing out as many of the big resin models as possible, bringing them into the plastic fold. I must admit, out of their various different options, I wasn't necessarily expecting them to visit the Typhon next. The thing is pretty cool and very Warhammer 40k, but maybe not one of Games Workshop's best known Forge World heavy tanks. I guess if they'd already made a reincarnation of the Spartan, then perhaps making the Typhon as an upgrade sprue for the same chassis isn't the worst idea. The tank has both Horus Heresy era rules and Warhammer 40k ones as well in the Imperial Armour Compendium, but in the lore the Typhon is basically a variant of the Spartan assault tank. It mounts the colossal Dreadhammer siege cannon, and was developed at the request of Perturabo, the Primarch of the Iron Warriors, who apparently wanted the enormous firepower of the Imperial army, but on a mobile tank that the Space Marines could field at speed. It was used in fairly good numbers by both the Iron Warriors and the Imperial Fists during the Great Crusade, so a bit of Legion rivalry there between the various siege armies, and in general it's a tank pattern that's fallen out of favour in the 41st millennium, but as with plenty of the other Forge World relic tanks, a few of them still seem to exist in certain chapters, but they're no longer in any sort of wide use or production. Model-wise, it's got the standard Horus Heresy era sponsons. Let's take a look at those. It seems that similar to a fair few similar tanks of the nature, they all seem to share a sponsoring kit, so you've got the option to field las cannons, heavy bolters, Volkite weaponry and heavy flamers, plus there's a few different options for the pintle weapons. The ones that they showed off here were just a heavy bolter and hunter-killer missile. The options are a little bit expanded from the 40k datasheet, much like several of the other ones. I don't believe that you could take the Volkite weaponry on the 40k tank. I guess it's not impossible that they might update the rules and datasheet for it the next time they redo the Imperial Armour Compendium. Comparing the new tank to the old, I feel like they've been pretty faithful to the design. Looks really quite similar. I feel like they might have toned down the sheer colossal size of the gun by at least just a little bit. It still seems pretty ridiculous compared to at least the vast majority of real world armour outside of Warhammer 40k, but it looks like it's maybe at least a touch scaled down from the really big version on the old tank on the right. In general though, it really does look like they've just gone out of their way to try and reproduce the vast majority of the old tank in newer plastic that doesn't have to deal with resin. Otherwise, it does look like the tank is built off the same sprue as the Spartan, basically just swap out the frame with the doors and front bits for the great big siege cannon. And my guess would be that it will probably be retailing for the same amount as the Spartan, that one's £67.50, $112, or €87.50. Certainly a fairly pricey beast, but not particularly out of keeping with Games Workshop's other big super heavy or big vehicle kits. If that does turn out to be the right price, it'd just be a tiny bit more expensive than the Space Marine Repulsor Executioner, for example. Overall, I feel like it's a fairly cool kit. It'd be interesting to see what other resin armour makes its way into plastic. Perhaps in a similar vein to this, I feel like at least a fair few people would really like to see a Vindicator laser destroyer. I wonder if we'll see one of those. Moving on, let's talk 40k rules for this thing then. And currently if you want to field a Typhon in Warhammer 40k, it'll cost you 320 points base, and you can field it either for Space Marines or Chaos. The Typhon is a Lord of War choice, not a heavy choice, despite being kind of similar to the Land Raider and not really all that much tougher. It does mean that you likely won't get any sort of chapter tactics or legion traits if you have it in a super heavy auxiliary. At least in Nephilim, the super heavy auxiliary detachment is free, but this thing does come with the relic keyword, meaning that as per the Imperial Armour Compendium rules, you have to pay an extra CP if you field one. Not insurmountable, but certainly a little bit painful in Nephilim. Statline wise, it moves 10 inches, hits on 3s at range, is strength and toughness 8, has 20 wounds base and a 2+ save, and 6 attacks in combat hitting on 5s with actual OK power in combat at strength 8, AP -2 and damage D3. Might be odds on to crush something like a light infantry or two at least. Keywords wise, it's a Titanic vehicle, so it can fall back and shoot, pretty useful for that enormous siege cannon, plus has the smoke keyword and machine spirit, both of which can be handy to target it with stratagems. A -1 to hit from the smoke will be pretty handy if it is about to get targeted by a bunch of stuff. Obviously the main event is that Dreadhammer siege cannon. It's got 2d6 shots at 24-inch range at strength 10, AP 4 and damage 3. It does perhaps feel like a gun that had its rules written at the start of 9th edition rather than the later end, and it does kind of show that its damage output isn't so spectacular right now. It's certainly not terrible and will pile some hurt onto whatever you throw it at, but it averages around about something like 3 dead Space Marines, 2 or 3 dead Terminators, around 9 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle, or about 4 wounds to a toughness 8 vehicle with a 5+ invul and -1 damage. It's not nothing, but the price tag of 320 points really does make that feel kind of underwhelming. And even compared to Space Marine armor, which isn't exactly the hottest thing at the moment, a pair of Vindicators will shoot a similar or higher amount than it, and cost around about 40 points less even if you're putting on the siege shields. Compared with recent and very strong armor, it just really doesn't hold up at all. For example, that siege cannon actually has less damage than a single Lehman Russ Executioner tank with Born Soldiers, and that's around about half the price. Obviously Lehman Russes are about as strong as armor gets right now, but still the fact that their firepower is roughly twice as good as this thing does kind of show that this one's just a little bit underpowered on the firepower front. I guess at least one advantage that it has is that it can fall back and shoot with Titanic, I suppose. Durability wise, it's not so bad. 20 wounds with a 2+ armor save and armor of contempt is okay for 320 points. It won't be the easiest to hide though, as the high wound count will mean that you can target it behind obscuring terrain, so it is going to be taking the brunt of enemy long range fire. I don't think that the damage and defense calculations really get a lot better adding sponsons either, unfortunately. On the 40k datasheet for the sponsons, you've got the options of the heavy bolters and the las cannons, 15 and 20 points for each of those. No options for heavy flamers or Volkite here. At that cost, they're just not really all that impressive, to be honest. I'd actually be kind of tempted just to leave them off and run the tank as very cheap, unless you know that you're going to be giving it multiple buffs to make its damage better. Maybe something like at least a Tech Marine to have it hit on 2s, and then they become a bit more of a tempting deal, I suppose. Otherwise, for its top weapon, it's got the choice of a heavy bolter, flamer, multi-melter, or storm bolter. Perhaps the multi-melter might be one of the most tempting out of those. 25 points for 2 melter shots on a tank that doesn't really mind too much getting up close. I'd say if you're going to add on an extra gun, then that one might be one of the most tempting, maybe. Overall, I must admit, it is a pretty underwhelming Forge World datasheet. Not really too hard to see why these things never get anywhere near considered for competitive lists, struggling to beat out standard Space Marine armor when even that is pretty poor compared with most of 40k at large. If you did like the kit and wanted to try and make one work though, I think I might honestly just be tempted to leave the sponsons off, maybe bolt on a multi-melter as the first upgrade, or just keep it cheap and tough. If you want to try and make big vehicles work, then for standard Space Marines, Iron Hands usually tends to be the way to go. They can get the Devastator Doctrine for 1 CP if needed, a Tech Marine can give it a +1 to hit and healing, the Iron Hands Psychic Power for Steel Armor for +1 to save is really quite handy, and potentially having it front and centre, maybe using 1 CP for smoke, is going to give them a big tank that the enemy might struggle to do anything about. I'll probably just put it somewhere front and centre in the army as a great big distraction, try and blow some important stuff up with the big cannon, hope it soaks up a fair amount of the enemy fire, and even maybe consider nuisance charges against things in combat, particularly seeing as it can fall back and shoot and is very tough. Still though, for Space Marines, things like an Astrius might be better if you can afford the extra points. For Chaos Marines, Iron Warriors perhaps seem the most appropriate all round. It is Perturabo's tank after all, and they do have the best synergy with shooting things. I feel like the buffing options for the Chaos Marines aren't quite as strong as the Loyalists for armor. Chaos generally seems best for the melee units and infantry and demonkin and things in general. But a couple of the Warlord traits could potentially help it out. You could get exploding 6s from wanton destruction all game long, and they have a stratagem for counting units as more models for the blast keyword, potentially quite meaningful if you targeted, say, a 6 strong elite infantry squad and you made it max out its blast shots. There's also a big 3 CP one if you want to make it really tough as well, giving it a -1 to wound, though realistically that's a bit too expensive to be using regularly. Otherwise, again, it's a reasonable target for a Warpsmith, a +1 to hit and a bit of healing doesn't hurt. I suppose in Iron Warriors you could also take the Techno-Venomous Mecha Tendrils for another very scary threat in the ranks. So overall, it's really quite a cool new model. I must admit the 40k rules just aren't particularly good for it at the moment. I'd guess that Games Workshop might well be rewriting the Imperial Armor Compendium sometime in 10th edition. I wouldn't hold out any massive hope for it getting particularly good before then, to be honest, unless they gave us some sort of surprise datasheet rewrite with their Forge World kits. Let me know what you make of the model and the rules for it though. I look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k things coming, with new videos out just about every day, and I will talk about Games Workshop's news and releases. Finally, if you've been enjoying all the updates on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked down in the video description if you're interested in helping support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.